At the height of its power, Rome believed the world itself could be marched into line. 3 shining legions, banners snapping over walls of shields and bronze, tramped north toward a nameless German forest, just another piece of chaos to be paved into empire. But beneath those dripping pines, the road narrowed, the sky darkened, and the trees began to whisper a different fate. Waiting in that green labyrinth was Arminius, Rome's perfect soldier and its perfect betrayer. On Roman maps, it is just a word, Germania, a smear of ink beyond the neat line of the Rhine. In reality, it is an endless tangle of wet pine and oak, mists that cling low to the ground, and rain that turns every path into a wound of mud. There are no marble forms here, no straight roads shining in the sun, only scattered villages of timber and thatch, and tribes who can vanish into the trees as if the forest itself swallows them. At night, branches crack where no one can be seen, and the dark between the trunks feels less like empty space and more like something watching. From Rome, it looks simple, another wild frontier waiting to be wrapped in stone and law. Augustus dreams of pushing the frontier beyond the Rhine, of stamping eagles into this dripping soil until even the northern winds blow in Latin. Engineers and legionaries swing axes into ancient trunks, drive stakes into boggy ground, and raise square forts whose walls press against the forest like clenched fists. Every new road cut through the green seems to prove the same thing, that Roman discipline can carve order out of any chaos. But out here, on the edge of the world, the trees close in again as soon as the axes fall silent, and the fog crawls back over every scar of the road, as if the land itself is testing Rome and waiting to answer. He begins as a hostage, a Germanic prince taken south into the marble heart of the empire, where boys of conquered blood are polished into Roman steel. In the camps along the Rhine and in the academies of Italy, Arminius learns Latin until he thinks in it, drills in Roman formations until his feet move with the legions, studies maps, supply lines, and the calm mathematics of conquest. He fights for Rome on other frontiers, proves himself brave, clever, reliable. The eagle standards cast their shadow over him, not as a threat, but as a promise. Citizenship follows. Then command of auxiliary troops by every measure that matters to the empire. Arminius is one of theirs. Then Rome sends him home. He rides back into Germania, not as a prince of the Cherusci, but as a Roman officer in crested helmet and segmented armor, and sees his old world through new eyes. Villages that once answered only to their own chieftains now bow to tax collectors and legal officials. Men who stood tall in the longhouses now stoop in Roman courts, fumbling with foreign words for fine and tribute. What had seemed, from Italy, like the gift of civilization now looks, from the mud and mist, like a slow strangling each law, each road, each fort a hand on his people's throat. Admiration curdles into something colder and harder. By day, Arminius sits in Varus's tent, trading polished Latin phrases over wine, advising the governor as the perfect local ally who knows every path and chieftain. By night, he slips out under the trees, the Roman cloak pulled tight against the rain, riding from tribe to tribe to whisper of revolt, of unity, of one perfect blow that could break the giant. He knows where the legions march, how they think, how they react when afraid, and he begins to braid that knowledge into a noose. Rome has given him its language, its rank, and its secrets. Now, in the dark between the pines, its hidden knife turns in his hand. The news arrives folded inside Arminius's words, like a knife wrapped in silk. He comes to Varus with reports of a serious disturbance deep in the interior tribes, refusing tribute. Courts defied. Roman officials threaten. On the wax tablet, it is just another provincial headache. In Arminius's calm explanation, it is a problem that must be crushed quickly. Before Augustus hears that Germania has slipped from his fingers, Varus, the governor who thinks in petitions and verdicts, listens to his trusted auxiliary commander and nods. Of course they will march. Of course Rome will restore order. There is, Arminius suggests, a quicker way. Instead of circling along the safer, known routes, they can cut straight through the Teutoburg Forest, a shortcut only a native could recommend with confidence. For a man like Varus, it sounds efficient, even elegant 3 legions, their baggage, and the usual cluster of traders, servants, and officials moving swiftly to stamp out trouble and return to the business of taxes and trials. The column that forms is not just an army, but a moving piece of Roman society. Creaking wagons and families strung out between walls of shields and spears. As they leave the open country, the road begins to narrow. The ruts deepen, and the light dies under the interlocking branches overhead. A few veterans glance uneasily at the tree line, at how sound seems to sink into the moss instead of echoing. But their concerns drown beneath the grind of wheels and shouted orders. At a bend in the path, Arminius reins in, salutes Varus, and politely asks leave to ride ahead and summon loyal German allies to their banner. The governor agrees, and the perfect soldier turns his horse toward the deeper green, vanishing into the forest while 3 legions march after him, step by step, into the tightening noose. The first warning is the sound of rain on armor, a steady, needling hiss that seeps into everything. The column grinds forward along a track that has ceased to be a road and become a wound gouged into the forest floor. Boots and hooves sucking at mud that tries to pull them down. Between the tree trunks, the mist hangs low and thick, turning the world into a tunnel of dripping bark and shadow where the man 10 paces ahead is a blur of red and iron. Men curse quietly as wagons lurch, as mules stumble, as shields bang together in the crush. But it is still the familiar misery of a hard march, unpleasant, not yet terrifying. Then the forest breathes in, and sound seems to vanish for a heartbeat. Out of that held breath comes a noise none of the Romans recognize at first, a long, skin-crawling blare of horns that do not sound like anything from Italy or Gaul. Another answers from somewhere off to the left, then a third from behind, their echoes bouncing strangely off the wet trunks until the entire wood seems to be howling. Before orders can be shouted, before centurions can even see where to point their men, the air thickens with javelins and stones, spears and arrows hissing out of the white fog. Men fold silently, or scream, or topple under the weight of shields suddenly sprouting iron. In open ground, the legions would shrug, lock shields, swing out into battle formation, and grind down whatever dared face them. Here, there is no room to breathe, let alone deploy. Cohorts are stretched into a thin, broken serpent between the trees. So when officers bellow for ranks to form, half their men cannot even hear the command, and those who do have nowhere to go. A wagon rears sideways as its axle shatters, blocking the path and crushing men who stumble into its wheels. Panicked horses try to bolt and slam into lines of infantry, turning precise formations into knots of flailing limbs and splintered spear shafts. Somewhere ahead, a trumpet sounds the signal to rally, but to most ears it is just another ghost voice in the fog, hid in the front, in the rear, and along the flanks by enemies they can barely glimpse. The Romans lash out in furious, isolated counterattacks that push shadows back for a moment before the forest swallows them again. Varus's officers carve out a rough patch of higher ground as the light fades, felling trees to build a ragged palisade while wounded men are dragged into the center. Bleeding into the churned mud, fires sputter and smoke instead of burning clean, their light swallowed by the mist. And the rain keeps whispering on helmets and canvas as if nothing unusual has happened. The legions have survived the first day, but as they huddle on bad ground ringed by invisible enemies, one thought moves through the camp like a chill wind, that for the first time, Rome has marched onto a battlefield it does not understand. Night does not fall on the Roman camp so much as seep into it, carried in on the rain. Fires burn low and sickly, choked by wet wood and the weight of the mist, throwing more smoke than light over rows of wounded men laid out on trampled, blood-slicked mud. Armor is piled in miserable heaps beside snapped javelins and shattered shields, gear that no one quite has the strength to clean or repair. Beyond the ragged line of makeshift palisades, the forest is a wall of black, branches dripping steadily, as if the trees themselves are patient, listening. In the largest tent, under a canvas that leaks in thin, mocking streams, Varus and his officers huddle over maps that no longer match the world outside. Scouts were sent out hours ago to find clear routes, friendly villages. Any sign of auxiliary support? None have returned. A centurion, voice low and careful, mentions what everyone has noticed and no one wants to say. Arminius rode ahead before the attack and has not been seen since, and no German allies have appeared at their lines. Varus tries to answer as a governor, speaking of order, procedure, reinforcements. But the words sound like courtroom echoes in a place where the only law is whatever waits between the trees. Outside the command tent, the camp hums with a different kind of conversation, carried in whispers between men hunched under cloaks. Some curse the Germans, some curse Varus. Some mutter that perhaps the gods have finally turned against Rome. More than a few simply sit in silence, fingers locked white around spear shafts and sword hilts. One legionary wipes his gladius again and again with a scrap of cloth already red, as if he can rub away the day, while a standard bearer grips the eagle so tightly his knuckles creak, as though that piece of bronze is the last solid thing left in the world. From somewhere out in the dark, horns sound once, twice. Then the slow, steady thump of drums begins, echoing through the forest like a heartbeat that does not belong to Rome. Morning comes without light. The rain that needled them yesterday has deepened into a gray curtain, pounding on helmets and sodden cloaks as if the sky itself is trying to hammer the legions into the mud. Varus orders the camp broken, the baggage cut down, leave what you must. He insists, we march for safety, for the Rhine, for any open ground where Rome can stand and breathe again. Men throw cooking pots, spare clothes, even treasured keepsakes into the muck, watching pieces of their lives sink as the column lurches forward. Each step, a wet, dragging argument with the earth. The forest is tighter now, branches clawing at shields and packs, trunks so close that formations dissolve into a thin, shivering line. Cohorts lose sight of each other around bends and ridges. A centurion looks back for his rear ranks and finds only trees, mist, and the echo of shouted Latin swallowed by the undergrowth. From the slopes and hollows come the now familiar horns and the sudden hiss of missiles. Not in one grand wave, but in constant. Gnawing bites here, a patrol shredded. There a file of men cut down before they know from which direction death is coming. Whenever the Romans manage to rally and charge toward the source of an attack, they find only trampled ferns and a few dropped spears. Arminius's warriors have already melted sideways through the trees, circling to strike somewhere else along the bleeding serpent of the column. As the day drags on, everything that makes the legions strong begins to rot away. Rations spoil in their sacks, turned to sour paste by the endless water. Bowstrings slacken, javelin shafts swell and warp, and men start slipping off pieces of armor just to keep their feet moving in the sucking mud. Orders arrive late or not at all as officers fall to arrows they never saw. And more than one unit staggers on for an hour before realizing it is alone. By evening, Varus is on his knees in the muck over a smeared map, tracing a desperate path towards safety with a filthy finger while thunder growls somewhere beyond the canopy. High on a ridge, half seen through trees and rain, Arminius watches the broken column dragging itself forward. And he does not need to attack because the forest, the weather, and time are already tightening the noose for him. By the third day, the forest has narrowed into a throat. The broken remnants of the legions stumble into a corridor pinched between a low, wooded ridge on one side and a quivering, reed-choked swamp on the other, with the road squeezed into a strip of churned filth barely wide enough for 2 men abreast. Only when the mists thin for a moment do the Romans see it, a rough earthwork running along the crest of the ridge, topped with logs and shields, a crude wall. But in this place, on this ground, it might as well be a fortress. As the realization spreads like a shiver through the ranks, the horns sound again from above, and the trap's final door swings shut. The first volleys come down from behind that wall, spears and arrows and stones plunging into the column that has nowhere left to sidestep. No open field into which to deploy. Varus's officers bellow for a charge up the slope, and exhausted cohorts slog forward, only to find the incline slick with mud, their hobnailed sandals skidding as they try to climb under a storm of missiles. Men fall backward onto their comrades, and entire files slide down in a clatter of iron to be trampled where they land. Others try to push along the track itself, only to be blocked by trees felled in advance, tangled barricades that turn the road into a slaughter pen, while the swamp on the far side sucks at any who stumble off the path, dragging armored men down into brown water that closes over their shouting mouths. Standards tilt, then vanish in the chaos. One eagle swallowed in the melee at the wall, another toppling into the bog, its last glint of gold disappearing beneath the surface as German warriors howl from the ridge and Arminius rides behind the earthwork, giving orders in Latin and in his own tongue, finishing the legions with the discipline he learned from them. At some point, there is no more army, only isolated knots of Romans fighting in circles, backs to one another in knee-deep mud, striking until their arms fail or the forest closes over them. Varus, wounded and watching his command dissolve into pockets of dying men, chooses the one act left that is his own, falling on his sword rather than be paraded as a trophy before the tribes he once governed. By late afternoon, organized resistance is gone. By dusk, the horns have fallen silent, and the only sounds are crows and the slow drip of rain from branches over a carpet of bodies, shields, and shattered spear shafts. In that nameless clearing, between the wall and the swamp, the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions cease to exist, erased so completely that for years, Rome will know them only as a wound hidden somewhere in the dark heart of the Teutoburg Forest. They come back in ones and twos, not as legions, but as ghosts, mud-caked, hollow-eyed men who limp across the Rhine with stories no one wants to believe. 3 eagles lost, they say. 3 entire legions swallowed by rain and trees and shouting barbarians in a forest whose name most Romans have never heard. On the frontier, officers read the first reports twice, 3 times, hunting for some line that says the standards were recovered, that reinforcements broke through, that this is anything but what it is. By the time the news reaches the forum, it moves in whispers. Something terrible has happened in Germania. In the Senate, words fail men who make their living with speeches. They sit staring at broken standards and casualty lists that run on like a wound that will not close. When the full report reaches Augustus, the emperor who thought he had chained the world, he does not react as a marble statue, but as an old man who has just been told that a part of himself has died. He tears his clothes, beats his head against the wall, and cries out into the stunned silence, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." Behind that outburst is a deeper, quieter fear. If 3 legions can vanish in the trees of the north, what else is the empire not seeing? Rome will survive this disaster. Its roads will still spread. Its armies will still march. And its emperors will still rule. But a defeat of this scale, 3 legions erased, their eagles gone. No glorious last stand to carve into stone, was almost unthinkable before Teutoburg. In that forest, it is not just soldiers who die, but the belief that Roman discipline and steel can master any ground, any enemy, anywhere. From this moment on, when Rome looks toward the dark line of the German woods beyond the Rhine, it no longer sees a future province, it sees the place where the empire learned to be afraid. When the last Roman shout has faded, Arminius walks the battlefield like a man pacing through a dream he has finally forced into being. He moves between bodies and wrecked equipment, ordering wounded enemies finished quickly, not out of mercy so much as to close the book on them. Around him, Germanic warriors strip weapons and armor from the dead, laughing, weeping, shouting his name to the dripping trees. Looking up at the dark canopy, he is said to murmur that the forest keeps what it takes. Word spreads faster than any messenger. To the tribes, Arminius becomes the man who broke the giant. The proof that the eagle can bleed, that Rome is not a god but flesh and bone. Songs grow around his name, sung low in longhouses and shouted in clearings, casting him as the chosen son of the forest who led them out from under the empire's shadow. Across the Rhine, his name takes on a different edge. Cursed in Latin as the greatest traitor of his age, the citizen and officer who turned trust and rank into knives. Yet even as his legend rises, his power makes other chieftains restless. Men who once followed his plans now whisper that he means to be king, that one Rome has gone only for another to take its place. And in the end, their plots find his back where Roman swords could not. Arminius dies, not on a battlefield, but in the tangle of his own people's rivalries, leaving no united Germania behind him, only the memory that the tribes once stood together long enough to shatter an empire's certainty. In that way, he remains in Teutoburg forever, not as a living commander, but as a ghost walking beneath the trees that helped him break Rome and then watched his own world break him. After Teutoburg, Rome does something it almost never does. It stops. There are raids, reprisals, and a few grim expeditions to recover what can be recovered. But the grand dream of pushing Roman order deep into Germania quietly dies among the trees. The Rhine hardens into more than a river. It becomes a line in the imperial mind, a northern edge beyond which there will be no network of colonies, no web of marble forums and straight roads imposing Latin on the land. What never appears behind those forests, Roman cities, Roman law. Roman habits is as important as what already stands on the empire's safe side of the water. Over the centuries, that absence becomes a shape on the map. West and south of the Rhine, the world grows in Roman patterns, cities on grids, bishops in old imperial seats, Latin words fossilized into French, Italian, Spanish, beyond it, in the lands Rome never fully tamed. A different current runs on Germanic tongues, looser tribal structures hardening later into kingdoms. A memory of having faced the empire in the woods and sent it home bleeding. When we talk about a Latin West and a Germanic heartland in medieval Europe, part of that invisible border was drawn the moment Augustus decided his legions would not march back into that forest. Today, the Teutoburg Forest is just another stretch of green on a satellite image. Walking paths and quiet clearings where tourists take photos and children chase each other between the trees. But if you know what happened, it is hard not to feel. Under the wind in the branches and the soft give of the earth, the echo of armor and the weight of a choice that redirected an empire. Here, long ago, the world's greatest military machine stepped forward, stumbled, and chose to stop leaving the trees themselves as a living boundary, stone whispering, even now. This far, no further.